Hi, this is Keith at shipwrightskills.com. Let's build this ram's horn sled together. Well, I drew this sled based on photographs I'd seen of primarily Swiss and German sleds from around the turn of the last century, and looked like a pretty fun way to enjoy the outdoors in the winter here in Vermont where it gets pretty cold, and I wasn't wrong. Let's build you one too. You want to start by lofting the entire sled. That's a full-size drawing that you can then use to make templates. You can constantly refer to it. It works out a lot better than a small plan where you have to constantly read a tape measure and measure things. So you start by making a nice baseline and a nice vertical center line that's 90 degrees to the baseline, so perpendicular. I then made a bunch more parallel lines to that on verticals, and then 90 degrees to those horizontal lines. I like to use dividers because I feel like it's pretty accurate. So once you have that big piece of graph paper to draw on, then you can start to draw the sled in earnest. Here I'm plotting the inside of the ski, which is what we'll use to make the template for the ski lamination jig. At the same time, you can draw the seat, you can draw the legs, you can draw the skis, you can draw all the bolts. Basically every angle, everything can be figured out at this point, so that way you have a nice set of plans to go from and there aren't any questions later. By doing this on a piece of light colored plywood, doesn't have to be thick, you've now created a durable set of plans, unlike a piece of paper, that can be used like a tool around the shop. So the first thing I did with this nice durable set of plans was drilled holes right through it. Then that'll allow you to stick an awl through the holes and poke into a piece of template that you've put below the lofting. Then you just kind of connect the dots with a pencil. That's one way to transfer from your lofting. There's a lot of ways. Then you can cut along that curve, and however you do that, it's up to you, but we're just making the jig for laminating the skis at this point. So it's got 2 layers of 3/4. You could cut one and shape it perfectly and then cut the second one with a flush trimming bit on the router, or you could just do what I did where I bandsawed them both out and then I screwed them together and belt sanded them the same. Whatever way you do it's up to you. You just want to make sure that there aren't bumps, and you want it to be square so that way the ski doesn't have any warp or twist or weird spots in it. So the more time you spend on this, the less time you'll spend trying to fix your ski later. So I selected very straight grain red oak for this. You can use a lot of different woods for this, but I went with red oak because it was available and I know it bends well. It's very straight grained, and it's not quite as heavy as white oak, so dragging it uphill I thought would be nice. After you rip it to width, then you can turn it up on edge and resaw it. Now, how you do this is up to you. I'm not recommending the way I'm doing it, but that's how I did it. I made 10 strips for each ski, plus a couple of extra ones to put on the outside to keep the clamps from denting everything. The next thing I did was to pre-bend all the laminations. So I did that with a heat gun. No moisture, no steam box, none of that. Just a heat gun, carefully, slowly, working all the pieces together around the jig so that way they know where they're going to go when you put the glue on them. You might cut your layers thin enough that you didn't need to do this, and then you wouldn't need to bend it with the heat gun, but I did. I left them a little thicker because I don't want to glue so many glue joints. 10 is enough. 10 layers is enough for me. So I used TotalBoat High Performance Epoxy on this with colloidal silica and micro balloons mixed in to the consistency of maybe mayonnaise, I guess, something like that. Something that I could, transfer onto the wood with a roller and would be thin enough to absorb into the wood, but thick enough that it wouldn't just fall on the floor when I started to do the glue up. The viscosity of the adhesive is pretty important too, because you don't want to squeeze all of it out of the wood when you're bending, so you want it to have enough thickness. It's not like something like Tight Bond. This would be a great place if you had a helper to help you. I have the jumpsuit on and the Tyvek sleeves because I knew I would get messy. You probably wouldn't need to get as messy as I did if you had a helper, but whatever. You do what you have to do. So you can get away with this because it's epoxy, and epoxy has a very long open time. I was using a medium cure here, which is perfect in my cool shop. In the summer, you want to think about it. If it's not too hot, though, you have plenty of open time, so no need to get frantic or panicked. You just slow and steady wins the race. Work all those pieces around without any gaps, and you'll be way happier with your ski if you do. But if you had a helper right now, you could work with 2 hands instead of 1. And if you have a friend who has clamps, borrow those clamps. You want to use all the clamps that you can find. I put a strip around the outside to defend the ski from the clamps, and I put packing tape on that strip. There it is. So that way it wouldn't get glued to the ski. And then I put packing tape on the jig, plastic on the bench, and a little bit of cardboard on the floor, and I didn't make a mess. As you can see, it comes right off the jig, no problem, no spring back, nice straight flat skis. Next thing to think about are the seat boards. I opted to steam bend the back end of my seat boards. You don't need to, but I just thought it looked cool and I thought it might be functional as well. So here's a very simple steam box made of a piece of PVC from the home supply store and a wallpaper steamer. I think the most important part here is that the steam is wet. If you have dry heat, your piece is not going to bend. It'll kiln dry it. So you want to have a ton of steam. You want a wet steam box. 3/4 of an inch is thick, but it's not that hard if the wood is hot enough. Again, you don't need to get frantic. You have time, but it is cooling pretty quickly, so you want to work inside of a couple minutes. I just use simple clamps. You could get, as complex with this as you want, but I just used a few clamps and walked the piece in. Once it got tight to the jig, I got the next piece out of the box and did the other one. So I had 2 jigs for the 2 outer seat boards. And then you just leave those for about a week and they'll be nice and dry and there won't be much spring back. So I cleaned up the glue from the sides of the skis, which is, substantial and not very easy to tool with like a hand plane, say. So I used a belt sander. I like a belt sander for that with dust collection and makes it quick and easy. So during this phase, you want to make sure that your ski is staying straight and flat and that you're not inducing any big bumps into it or anything. So you want to treat it like it's going to be ready to go at this point. So I sanded it right to 120. We'll do a little hand sand to 150 before glue up, but that's about it. So again, using your lofting, you can transfer the end cuts for the skis right onto the skis themselves with no measuring or any of that. You just drawing lines. It's very simple. It's like tracing. I used a jigsaw to cut the ends off. You can use whatever you want, but I like a jigsaw for this. It leaves kind of a rough cut though, or at least this blade did. So I had to take some hand tools to it. There's a little round file. There's a Cliff Dufton carving knife. That thing's awesome for this. Rasps, files, sandpaper, you name it. Whatever you have, try to make the end pretty. And I'm picky, so I wanted it to look just like I did the sides. So I sanded it right to 150 eventually. So here I am taking any little dents or any imperfections off of the faces of the skis, the top and bottom, and just being careful to keep everything 90 degrees. So at this point, those skis should be ready to go, sanded to 120. The next step is to figure out the mortise and tenon joints for the thwarts and the skis. So there's a leg laid again right onto the lofting, and I'm just tracing the locations for the for the tenons onto the legs. So you can take the angles, all that stuff, and you don't ever need to know what that angle actually is at this point. You just transfer it. Simple. So I transferred it onto every face so that when I cut it, if I cut a line off, I still have other lines on the other faces. So the tenons are different on either end. Each leg has 2 tenons, top and bottom, different angles. So you want to carefully lay out each one, and double check and make sure that you didn't put the angle going the wrong way on one or any of that stuff. And then I used a pencil in a combo square here because I can see the pencil really well when I'm hand sawing, which is what we're about to do. You could do these cuts with power tools, but I just went with hand saws. It's kind of fun too. Once everybody's laid out, then you can get your saws out. These are Z saws that I'm using. This is a ripping saw, so when you're going with the grain, if you just use this Japanese ripping saw, you can get right pretty much to your line. Again, you could use any tool you want, but this is what I use. Once the rip cuts are done, then you turn it sideways and get out a cross-cutting saw, and you can cut the shoulders of the tenons. And everything will pretty much go together right off the saw. And if you cut outside your line, make sure you cut outside your line, not inside. Then you can actually fix it with a chisel. It's a lot easier to take a little bit more wood off than it is to put more on. Here I am laying the mortises out onto the thwarts. So you want to be thinking about what you're doing here, and I wanted to just double check, make sure a couple times that I didn't do anything wrong at this point. So by doing it right on top of the lofting, you pretty much can't go wrong. This also gives you like a good chance to sort of visualize how everything's going to go together. The lofting makes it easy. So I like to drill out the waste in the mortises a little bit with just a drill bit ahead of time before I get out the chisel. I think it saves me a little bit of time. It's a little easier on the chisels in your hands. But you can do it however you want. So here you could use dowels, you could use dominoes or screws or whatever you want. But I just went with a big mortise and tenon joint. It's going to get glued together with high strength epoxy and reinforced with steel. So I'm pretty confident that this will be a good joint. So now you want to think about how the legs are going to go into the skis. Here I'm using a wheeled marking gauge and a marking knife to lay out the mortise. I like to use these because it gives the chisel a place to reference when you start your cut, which is handy. So here's the mortise. I cut them square, straight up and down, and then cut the angle, because there's an angle on one side of the mortise, just by eye, by setting my bevel gauge to my lofting, so I know the leg angle, and just leaning it up there and looking at it. You want to be careful, but if you're slightly off at this point, it's correctable. But you want to just sort of, think it through. This angled mortise isn't necessarily the easiest thing in the world, but it's also not the hardest. So if you don't drill out the waste, this is what it looks like. And it's actually a little slower and more methodical and potentially more accurate way to cut the mortise, especially one that's angled. Things can go wrong with the drill bit in a hurry, I suppose. And the chisel just takes off smaller pieces at a time. So you can kind of see the angle there. Anyway, now you should be feeling pretty happy with the form of this thing. It looks pretty good. Let's take a little break and come back for part 2. I want to thank TotalBoat and Jamestown Distributors for supplying everything for this build, from the hardware to the paint, the glue, you name it. Go to their websites and get the goods. I'm also working on a build-along comic and a blog on my website at shipwrightskills.com. Shipwright Skills on Instagram.